What's up, Manna students? Mackenzie here. I am so excited to bring you week 2 of our series called Squad Up. We're going to jump in right where we left off last week. We were in the book of Ephesians. That's where we're going to be today. The book of Ephesians was written by one of the early church leaders. His name is Paul. Remember that the church isn't a place or a building or even an event. The church is people. That's what we talked about last week. In the early days of the church, there wasn't social media, there wasn't texting, there wasn't phones. What there was letter writing, and so Paul wrote this letter of Ephesians to the church in Ephesus, and we're going to look at it more today about what he was writing to them. But before we dive in today, I want to make sure that you understand that in the early church, there was 2 groups of people. The early church was made up of 2 groups of people, the Jews and the Gentiles. So Jesus, by the way, was a Jew, but the Jews were chosen, God's chosen people chosen by God to spread his word, or tell his story, which is where we get the Old Testament from. So those are the Jewish people. And then we have the Gentiles, which Gentiles literally means everybody else who wasn't a Jew. And so if you weren't Jewish back then you were considered a Gentile. So we have the Jews and the Gentiles. But before the start of the church, the Jews and the Gentiles were not usually people that we found hanging around each other. They didn't hang out together. They didn't do a lot of stuff together. And for generations, they had actually pretty big issues and a lot of differences that actually divided them. Now, when Jesus arrived and declared that everybody is a part of his church, Jew and Gentile, were invited to be a part of his family, some of the Jews and Gentiles were finally able to put aside their differences and join together. But getting along wasn't always easy. So Paul knew that there was some walls of separation that would be put up between the Jews and the Gentiles, but that wall of separation couldn't exist between all of the followers of Jesus. And so if the church was going to survive, then Paul had to do something about it. Paul had to speak on this issue. And so that's where we're jumping into today in Ephesians 2, 11 through 13 is where we're going to start. So it says, "Therefore, remember that formerly you who are Gentiles by birth and called uncircumcised by those who call themselves the circumcision, which is done in the body by human hands. Remember that at that time you were separate from Christ, excluded from citizenship in Israel and foreigners to the covenants of the promise, without hope and without God in the world. But now, in Christ Jesus, you who were once far away have been brought near by the blood of Christ." There's a lot going on here, but in a really quick summary, there's 2 walls that we're talking about here. So the first wall is the wall that separates the Jew and the Gentile, and the second wall is the wall that separates us from God, or the people from God. And so this wall that was between us and God wasn't a wall that was built by disagreements or issues that were built up throughout years of not getting along. This was the wall that was built by sin. It was a wall built by our rebellion against God. Paul says through Jesus, this wall can be knocked down. This is where this week's big idea comes from. It is the church is meant to be a church without walls, which is actually another one of our operational principles. To fully understand what this means, we need to talk about the wall that exists between us and God. And Paul writes about this in Ephesians 2, 1 through 10. He says, "As for you, you were dead in your transgressions and sins in which you used to live when you followed the ways of this world and the ruler of the kingdom of the air, the spirit who is now at work in those who are disobedient. All of us also lived among them at one time, gratifying the cravings of our flesh and following its desires and thoughts. Like the rest, we were by nature deserving of wrath. But because of his great love for us, God, who is rich in mercy, made us alive with Christ even when we were dead in transgressions. It is by grace you have been saved, and God raised us up with Christ and seated us with him in the heavenly realms in Christ Jesus, in order that in the coming ages he might show the incomparable riches of his grace, expressed in his kindness to us in Christ Jesus. For it is by grace you have been saved, through faith, and this is not from yourselves, it is the gift of God, not by works, so that no one can boast. And for we are God's handiwork, created in Christ Jesus to do good works, which God prepared in advance for us to do." The word saved in this passage, the word saved means that God or Jesus saved us from a life and eternity without God. Sin is what we needed to be saved from. It's what robs us of our relationship with God. It's what put the wall up between us and God. And because of our sin, because of that sin, we are all separated from Him. But God sent His Son Jesus to fix it, and Jesus did fix it. Through His death and resurrection, Jesus was able to tear down that wall that was separating us from God, and He made a way for us to be reconciled. In this chapter, Paul talks a lot about reconciliation. So what does it mean to be reconciled? Well, first, Paul describes the way that Jesus tore down the walls, which is verse 14, between the Jews and the Gentiles and between us and God. It's incredible that Jesus did this for us, but that's not all that He did. He didn't just tear down the wall. What Jesus did is Jesus showed us how to create something new after the wall was torn down. A new way for us to be close to God and a new way for Jew and Gentiles to relate to one another. Although we were separated from God and from each other, God decided to make reconciliation possible for us. Through Jesus, we can have peace with God and with others. Don't get me wrong, it's not always easy to reconcile with people or with others, to reconcile with people that we disagree with, and tearing down a wall can be difficult, and it can be something that is even challenging when it comes to having to humble ourselves or ask for forgiveness or to even give forgiveness. Because of Jesus' death and resurrection, though, we can be reconciled with God and with others, and Jesus actually modeled for us how we can walk out this reconciliation. Just like God called the Jews and the Gentiles to reconcile and make peace with each other back then, God is still asking us to make peace and reconcile with each other today. Just like God took the first step toward us, He's asking us to take a step toward others. Just like Jesus tore down the wall that divided us from God, He wants us to tear down the walls between us and others. And just like Jesus built a new way and a new life for us to connect with God, He wants us to live in that. Why? Because we're God's family, and as God's family, we get to be the church, and we need to be a church without walls. This means that we need to recognize that everything that God made, He made well. To be one church, we need not be divided by race, social status, or popularity. The church is actually to provide a culture of reconciliation and healing, and if we remember that we are the church, then we need to be a part of that healing and reconciliation with each other. That means we may need to be humble. We may need to seek out humility. We may need to seek out forgiveness from other people who we may have hurt, and we may need to ask for forgiveness from others around us. This allows us to tear down the walls for those who may not know God, so that we can be a part in delivering the gospel to the people who may not know Him. Manna students, we're going to talk about this further in our small group discussion questions. We would love to chat with you in our small groups, or you can find the questions in the comments and description below.